This is my home now. Don't come back. The message glowed stark white against the dark screen of my phone, illuminating the dim interior of my sedan. The smell of stale gas station coffee hung heavy in the cold October air trapped inside the car. Outside, freezing rain drummed a hard, erratic rhythm against the windshield, distorting the red taillights of the semi-trucks rolling down the interstate. Under my thumb, the stiff paper edge of my real estate closing envelope felt sharp enough to draw blood. I stared at the photograph my sister had attached to the text. Kelsey was smiling her practiced, bright realtor smile right in the middle of my living room. She stood flanked by 2 oversized suitcases and a plastic package containing a brand new brass deadbolt. My name is Danielle, and at 38 years old, I make my living as a senior insurance claims analyst. My entire career is built on spotting anomalies, reading the fine print, and anticipating the exact moment someone's elaborate lie is going to catch up with them. Looking at my sister's selfie, I was watching the biggest lie of her life detonate. I did not call her back. Instead, I opened my email and found the final confirmation from the title company sitting at the top of my inbox. The document was time-stamped at exactly 12 minutes past 3 that afternoon. The sale was legally complete, and the funds were securely resting in my account. I was currently parked at a service plaza 68 miles away from Riverton, with nearly 3 hours of driving left through the stormy weather before I reached my new, quiet life in Ashford. I typed 5 words and hit send. Enjoy it while you can. Kelsey genuinely believed she had me cornered. By physically occupying the space, my younger sister assumed she would force my hand, relying on my lifelong habit of avoiding public family scenes. Our mother had clearly acted as her spotter. Carol must have watched me haul the final load of boxes to my car just a few hours earlier and immediately tipped Kelsey off that the apartment was empty. They thought I was simply running away from the pressure. Neither of them realized I had spent the last 2 months quietly and methodically stripping that apartment of everything that mattered. Every photograph, every piece of grandmother's jewelry, and every single important financial file had been safely relocated to a storage vault. The only items left in those rooms were the heavy pieces of furniture specifically written into the buyer's contract. I drafted a quick, precise message to the Lakeview Towers building manager. I informed him that an unauthorized person had gained access to Unit 400 and requested that he preserve all hallway camera footage and electronic access logs for the evening. I did not dial the police. I no longer owned the property, and my lawyer had been explicitly clear about stepping back. The new owner would be arriving any minute with his own key, and it was entirely his right to assert possession. The silence in my car lasted exactly 45 minutes. Then, my phone began to vibrate violently against the center console. Kelsey's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. It stopped, then immediately started buzzing again. On the 3rd attempt, I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear without saying a word. "Danielle, you need to come back here right now." Her voice was breathless, entirely stripped of the smug victory from her earlier text message. Through the receiver, I heard the faint, distinct sound of a solid wood door slamming shut, followed immediately by the metallic click of a lock turning. My sister had barricaded herself somewhere inside the unit, most likely the master bedroom. "I am on the highway, Kelsey," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I am not turning around. Victor is here." She was whispering now, her breath hitching in her throat. "He just walked into the apartment." "Danielle? He has a key." I kept my eyes fixed on the rain washing over the glass. "He is the new owner. He has every right to be there." "No, you don't understand." A ragged sob broke through her frantic whisper. "Tell him you let me stay. Just tell him I am supposed to be here." "Why, Victor?" I asked. The line went dead quiet. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the rain beating against my car roof and the heavy, panicked rhythm of my sister breathing through the speaker. Victor's arrival had completely derailed her plan. The wealthy investor standing in my former living room was supposed to be nothing more than a mark to her. "You don't understand what he thinks I did," she finally choked out. I shifted the car into drive, my foot resting heavily on the brake pedal. I understood perfectly. I had known the truth for months, ever since Victor had reached out to me with a gray folder full of carefully forged documents. "Just tell him you knew about the escrow," Kelsey pleaded, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Danielle, please. Tell him you authorized the deposit." I looked down at the heavy manila envelope on the passenger seat, the one holding my legitimate closing papers. My sister had built an invisible cage out of stolen signatures and fraudulent wire transfers, and now she was begging me to step inside it and lock the door behind myself. "I never authorized a sale, a deposit, or an escrow," I said. "Danielle," she whispered, the sound tight and desperate. "If Victor has those papers, Mom and I are both going down." I ended the call. I dropped the phone into the cup holder, took my foot off the brake, and merged back onto the dark highway, leaving them to the exact consequences they had earned. 9 months before that rainy drive to Ashford, the trap had already started closing around me. It began with the smell of roasted chicken and the scrape of a wooden chair against the dining room floor. My mother hosted Sunday dinner at her house in the suburbs, a weekly ritual that usually ended with a financial request. Carol set a ceramic serving dish in the center of the table, wiped her hands on an embroidered towel, and slid a folded county envelope across the polished wood. The document stopped right next to my water glass. A property tax notice, printed with a bold red warning about an overdue balance. "Your sister is going through a temporary rough patch," Mom said. She poured herself a glass of iced tea, pointedly avoiding my eyes. "The county is threatening a lien. We need to keep the family afloat, Danielle." Normally, I would have reached for my checkbook without a single question. For years, I had functioned as the designated cleanup crew for our family. My signature sat at the bottom of a thick stack of hospital payment agreements from the year our father died, securing the medical debt so his treatments could continue. I had paid the entire security deposit on Kelsey's first apartment after her messy divorce, and I had handed over the keys to my own car for 6 long months when hers finally broke down. But that evening, looking at the bright red ink on the tax bill, a cold and heavy exhaustion settled deep into my bones. I left the envelope sitting on the table. "I need to see the full billing statements, Mom. And I need to know the exact deadline from the county." Kelsey dropped her fork. The silver hit her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter. "Are you kidding me?" My younger sister leaned back and crossed her arms over her chest. "Mom is asking for a little help, and you are turning Sunday dinner into a financial audit." "An audit requires receipts," I told her, picking up my glass. "I am just asking for a number." They exchanged a fast, silent look across the table. That single glance communicated everything I needed to know about my position in the household hierarchy. My money was considered a communal resource, and asking for basic accountability was being treated as an act of treason. The next morning, I took my lunch break at a different bank branch across town. I sat in a quiet cubicle and systematically dismantled their access to my financial life. I changed my online banking passwords, removed Kelsey as an authorized user on my backup credit card, and opened a new savings account that neither of them knew existed. After leaving the bank, I stopped at a private mailing center and paid for a post office box in cash. My final stop was a safe deposit vault. Into a secure steel drawer, I placed my birth certificate, my grandmother's jewelry, and a thick folder containing the original copies of my father's medical receipts. The branch manager watched me lock the metal box. She tilted her head, her expression sympathetic. "Are you dealing with an identity theft issue?" I slid the brass key onto my ring. "I am trying to make sure the answer to that stays no." Those quiet boundaries extended into my professional life over the next few weeks. I spent my evenings studying for a senior risk management certification, building an exit strategy out of Riverton. My coworker Lena had forwarded me an internal posting for a regional director position at our Ashford office, and I was spending hours polishing my resume. The phone rang late on a Tuesday night while I was reviewing liability modules. Kelsey's name lit up the screen. I answered on speakerphone, keeping my eyes on my notes. "I need you to look at a purchase agreement right now," Kelsey said, her voice tight with panic. "My broker is breathing down my neck, and the client wants to add a contingency clause I do not understand." I closed my textbook. In the past, I would have spent 3 hours rewriting the contract to save her real estate commission. "That is a legal document for your job, Kelsey. If you do not understand the contingency, You need to ask your managing broker to explain it to you. He will think I am stupid. Then you need to study the material until you understand it. I cannot practice real estate without a license. I reached forward and ended the call. My refusal to play the savior accelerated their timeline. A month later, about 8 months before the final closing date, the consequences of my new boundaries arrived right at my front door. I was making coffee on a Saturday morning when Kelsey unlocked my apartment deadbolt and pushed the door open. She walked in wearing a tailored blazer, followed closely by an older gentleman in a wool coat and a younger woman navigating a lightweight wheelchair over the threshold. "This is the open floor plan I was telling you about," Kelsey announced, gesturing grandly toward my living room. I set my mug on the granite counter, staring at the strangers in my kitchen. Kelsey had a spare key, one she was supposed to use strictly for emergencies. Instead, she was using it to run an impromptu open house. The older man noticed my rigid posture immediately. He stepped forward and offered a polite, firm handshake. "Victor Hale," he said, his voice calm and professional. "And this is my daughter, Elise. Kelsey mentioned your unit might be available for an off-market transition." I looked at my sister. Her smile was brittle, a silent demand for me to play along and not embarrass her in front of a wealthy client. Elise wheeled herself forward, her eyes scanning the wide hallways and the lack of threshold steps between the kitchen and the living space. "The accessibility here is excellent," she noted, her tone completely practical. "Are the walls between the bedrooms soundproofed?" They were serious buyers. Victor carried himself like a man who evaluated property investments for a living, and Elise was looking at my home not as a favor, but as a genuine, functional solution to her daily needs. "The acoustics are very good," I answered Elise, keeping my voice steady. Then I turned to the older investor. "But there has been a misunderstanding, Mr. Hale. I am considering a career relocation, but I am not ready to sell this property." Victor frowned slightly, his gaze shifting from me to the real estate agent standing near the door. He nodded once, a gesture of polite retreat. "My apologies for the intrusion. When you are ready to list, let us know." After the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the buyers, the silence in the apartment stretched tight. Kelsey dropped her professional posture, and her face twisted in pure frustration. "You just cost me a massive commission," she snapped, pacing across the hardwood floor. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to find a ground-floor condo with widened doorways in this market? You brought strangers into my home without asking." Kelsey stopped pacing. She looked around the quiet, organized apartment, her eyes lingering on the empty armchair in the corner. "You do not even use half this place. People with families need homes more than you do, Danielle." The entitlement in her voice was absolute. She genuinely believed that because my life did not look exactly like hers, my property was surplus, waiting to be reassigned to someone she deemed more deserving. "My home is not empty just because I live here alone," I told her, stepping forward to open the front door. "Leave." She walked out, but not before I caught, where her gaze flicked right before crossing the threshold. She was looking at her own hand, her fingers tightly gripping the spare brass key that Mom had originally copied for her. I should have demanded the key back right then. I should have called a locksmith to change the deadbolt that very afternoon. I believed my firm refusal was enough to close the subject, assuming my sister would simply move on to another listing. I would find out much later that on the exact same evening I told Victor the apartment was not for sale, a text message pinged on his personal phone. The message was sent directly from Kelsey's number. "My sister changed her mind," the text read. "She wants to proceed with an off-market sale, and she wants no public listing." 4 months before that rainy drive to Ashford, an email arrived in my inbox. The subject line referenced a property address. My property address. The sender, Victor Hale, wrote a polite but firm paragraph asking why the title company claimed they had no record of our transaction, especially since he had wired the earnest money and renovation reserve 2 months prior. My first instinct told me it was a phishing scam. My second instinct, honed by years of insurance claims analysis, told me to verify the source. I ignored the contact information in his email footer. Instead, I searched for his real estate investment firm online and dialed the public corporate number. Victor answered on the second ring. His voice sounded calm, lacking the typical aggression of a scammer. He recited my address, my sister's full name, and a total figure of $120,000. According to him, the funds were sitting in an escrow account. The older investor explained that he possessed a notarized seller authorization, a preliminary title commitment, and a long chain of emails from a domain that looked almost exactly like a legitimate local title company. The man had caught the discrepancy himself. Before transferring the remaining purchase price, Victor had called the title company's main line to confirm wiring instructions. The receptionist told him they had never heard of the file. We met 2 days later in a conference room at my attorney's office. Victor set a thick gray folder on the mahogany table. The heavy paper stock made a dull, solid thud against the wood. Inside lay the fraudulent escrow package. My lawyer, Mr. Sterling, spread the documents out under the fluorescent lights. There was a fake seller authorization, fake title commitments, wire confirmations, and an agreement allocating $90,000 for accessibility renovations. At the bottom of the authorization page, my signature stared back at me. The blue ink perfectly mimicked the slight leftward slant and heavy final pressure of my handwriting. Something about the spacing felt too familiar. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of my father's medical receipts, placing a specific hospital billing agreement next to the fake authorization. A tiny ink splatter sat just below the loop of the letter D on both pages. A faint shadow from a crease in the original paper appeared in the exact same spot on the real estate document. The air in the conference room seemed to turn thin and cold. Kelsey had weaponized the very documents that proved how much I had sacrificed to keep our father alive. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses. This was not a crude copy-and-paste job. Kelsey had blended the signature into the new page, printed it, and scanned it again to mimic a document signed in wet ink. The notary seal came from an old closing packet, and the real notary had already confirmed that she had never met me. My hand drifted toward my phone lying on the table. I wanted to call my mother and demand an explanation for how Kelsey got her hands on those hospital files. Sterling placed his palm flat over my screen. The lawyer warned me that if I tipped them off, the project file on my sister's laptop could be deleted in seconds. The shell company holding the stolen money could be emptied and closed before we could secure a freeze. I took a slow breath and pulled my hand back. I asked Victor for the wire transfer records and the complete email headers. The investor slid his phone across the table, bringing up a text message from Kelsey. "She is too afraid of conflict to challenge family paperwork," the message read. I did not defend myself. My personality was irrelevant to the evidence sitting under the bright lights. I simply asked my attorney to issue preservation notices to my sister's brokerage. Then I looked at the wire confirmations Victor had provided. The bank records showed the $120,000 landing in the fake escrow account. The very next morning, exactly $38,000 had been transferred out. The receiving account belonged to Carol Walsh. The certified title report rested on Mr. Sterling's desk, thick and unblemished. That single stack of paper confirmed I remained the sole owner of the Lakeview Towers unit. There were no valid liens, no mortgages, and absolutely no public record of Kelsey's fraudulent escrow. My lawyer leaned back in his leather chair and explained the legal reality. Victor held a massive financial claim against my sister's shell company, but he possessed no claim against my property. A clean title meant I could legally sell the apartment, provided the transaction served a genuine economic purpose rather than acting as a retaliatory sting operation. An opportunity for that genuine purpose had already materialized. 2 weeks later, Human Resources at my firm offered me the regional director position in Ashford, Indiana. The new office sat 165 miles west of Riverton, a drive that took nearly 3 hours in bad weather. I signed the employment contract the same afternoon and wired the security deposit for a small, temporary rental apartment near my new workplace. Naturally, I did not mention the relocation or the new address to anyone in my family. Moving my life required quiet, methodical precision. Over the next month, I transported my winter coats, the family photo albums, and my grandmother's remaining jewelry in the trunk of my sedan. Lena, my coworker, spent her Saturday afternoons helping me tape up the heavier cardboard boxes. We were finishing the kitchen packing when a sharp knock rattled my front door. My mother walked in without waiting for an invitation. Carol froze in the entryway, her eyes darting from the stacked boxes to the bare pantry shelves. She pulled out her phone and snapped a quick photograph of a box labeled for the Ashford move, her mouth pressing into a thin line. The impending move prompted Victor to submit a formal purchase agreement. He offered full market value based on an independent appraisal, maintaining that the ground floor accessibility still perfectly suited his daughter. I hesitated over the contract, staring at the signature line. Selling to the man my sister had defrauded felt dangerously close to vengeance. Elise wheeled herself up to the edge of the conference table, noticing my hesitation. "Buying a home from you does not erase what your sister did," the younger woman stated, her voice remarkably pragmatic. "It only means the home goes to the person who actually paid for it." I picked up the pen and signed my name. Desperation makes people sloppy. 3 days before the final closing date, Carol summoned me to her house for dinner. Kelsey was already waiting in the dining room, sliding a stapled document across the tablecloth before I even took a seat. The header read as a temporary occupancy agreement. My sister demanded I grant her short-term housing, shouting that my empty condo was a waste of family resources. I read through the pages slowly, ignoring her rising voice. Buried on page 4, a hidden right of first refusal clause sat waiting for my signature. It was a desperate legal maneuver designed to legitimize her fake escrow scheme after the fact. I took out my phone, photographed every single page, and slid the packet back across the wood. "You do not even trust your own family," Kelsey snapped, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. "Trust is not a signature you can borrow." I turned and walked out the front door. The final closing proceeded without a single disruption. At exactly 12 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, I signed the last page of the deed transfer. I immediately notified the building manager that my unreturned spare key was no longer authorized, requesting a mandatory lock change. The local locksmith could not arrive until later that evening, a risk Victor accepted while the manager promised to monitor the hallway. Cold rain began to fall as I carried my final overnight bag out of the Lakeview Towers lobby around 10 minutes past 4. I loaded the trunk, pulling my coat tight against the freezing October wind. What I could not see from the driver's seat was the silver sedan parked across the street. The exterior security camera recorded Carol watching my car pull away from the curb. The footage captured her picking up her phone and typing a rapid text message. Less than an hour later, the interior lobby camera recorded Kelsey stepping through the sliding glass doors, dragging 2 oversized suitcases and clutching a plastic package containing a brand new brass deadbolt. The rain battered the windshield of my sedan as I merged back onto the dark interstate. My phone lit up the center console, vibrating violently against the plastic cup holder. Kelsey was calling back. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the cold, textured leather of the steering wheel, letting the automated system pick up the line. A red notification icon appeared on the screen a minute later. I pulled into the parking lot of my new Ashford rental 2 hours later, my joints stiff and my feet freezing from the long drive. The small apartment smelled like fresh paint and industrial carpet cleaner. I sat on the bare living room floor, flipped open my laptop, and pressed play on the voicemail. "Danielle, pick up," Kelsey pleaded through the small speakers. Her voice carried a frantic, ragged edge. "Just tell him you approved the escrow. Tell the police it was a family arrangement. Then Mom and I can fix the papers. Please." I wrote down the exact time of the recording in my notebook. She had just admitted to the fraudulent escrow on a recorded line, genuinely believing her desperation would force my compliance. A second email pinged in my inbox. The Lakeview Towers building manager had forwarded the official incident report and the hallway security footage to shield the condominium association from any liability. I clicked the video file, watching the rest of the evening unfold through the silent, grainy lens of the overhead cameras. Victor stood near the elevator banks in the recording, maintaining a careful distance from my old front door. The building manager approached him, holding a digital tablet. The screen glowed in the dim hallway, confirming that my sister did not appear on any authorized resident list and that the final closing had been legally recorded. A local locksmith arrived a few minutes later, carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. Kelsey stepped out of the apartment, waving a printed sheet of paper at the tradesman. The locksmith shook his head, zipped his bag shut, and walked away. She had failed to produce a valid deed, and professional lock installers did not risk breaking into private property on the word of an angry trespasser. The elevator doors opened again. Carol marched down the corridor, her raincoat dripping water onto the carpet. My mother stepped directly between Victor and the apartment door, jabbing her finger in the air. Even without audio, her argument was completely transparent. She was trying to frame the situation as a private family misunderstanding. She thrust a stapled document toward the new owner. I recognized the thick paper immediately. It was the exact same temporary occupancy agreement she had tried to force me to sign during our disastrous family dinner. Victor did not even reach for the pages. He simply crossed his arms and waited. The flashing red and blue lights of local law enforcement illuminated the hallway windows 20 minutes later. 2 patrol officers stepped off the elevator. They did not arrive to investigate a complex wire fraud or an elaborate forged escrow account because Victor understood that real estate disputes required civil attorneys and financial investigators. The officers were there strictly to secure the scene and verify current legal possession. Victor handed them his legitimate closing documents. The building manager showed them the updated ownership registry. The lead officer turned to Kelsey, gesturing firmly toward the open apartment door. My sister stepped out into the hall. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and her shoulders hunched inward as she attempted to maintain her familiar posture of victimhood. The performance failed entirely. The building manager returned with 2 large black trash bags, holding them out for her. No one threw her belongings into the hallway. No one screamed. The polite, quiet efficiency of the eviction made her defeat absolute. Kelsey was forced to pack the brand-new deadbolt and her clothes into the plastic sacks under the watchful eyes of the police. Elise wheeled her chair off the elevator just as Kelsey dragged her bags toward the exit. The younger woman did not mock my sister or offer any triumphant remarks. Elise simply looked at her father and asked if the unit was safe to enter. That crushing normalcy, the simple reality of a family taking possession of the home they had purchased, finalized the end of my sister's delusion. I closed the video player and leaned back against the cold apartment wall. A second voicemail notification vibrated on my phone. "Kelsey only used your signature because you refused to help," Carol's voice announced, entirely devoid of an apology. "You forced her into a corner, Danielle. Families do not steal from each other." I sat in the quiet dark for a long time. My mother genuinely believed that blood ties granted them absolute immunity from the law. I attached both audio files to an email and sent them directly to Mr. Sterling. My attorney called me less than 5 minutes later. "Do not delete that second message," Sterling instructed, his tone remarkably sharp. "Your mother just changed this from a solo act of fraud into a coordinated conspiracy." Morning light hit the cheap blinds of my Ashford rental, casting sharp, dusty lines across the mattress. My phone screen had been flashing bright white in the dark for 3 solid hours. Dozens of notifications piled up on the lock screen, flooding in from social media and distant relatives. I sat up, pulled the blanket around my shoulders, and tapped the first alert. Kelsey had drafted a public post at 2 in the morning. My sister attached a photograph of herself, sitting on a curb, surrounded by black trash bags, mascara tracking dark lines down her cheeks. The caption accused me of selling our family home behind everyone's back, claiming I had called the police to throw a single mother out onto the freezing street during a mental health crisis. The comment section overflowed with outraged responses from people I had known since childhood. My mother did not post online. Carol worked the telephone instead, operating through the quiet, efficient network of her church group and our extended family. The device buzzed in my hand before I could close the application. Aunt Margaret's name appeared on the caller identification. I swiped to answer, bracing myself against the headboard. "You need to call the police and drop whatever charges you filed against your sister," Margaret demanded without offering a greeting. Her voice crackled through the speaker, thick with righteous disappointment. "Your mother is absolutely beside herself, Danielle. Sending armed men to terrorize your own flesh and blood over a real estate misunderstanding is just cruel." My cousin chimed in from the background, yelling that Kelsey deserved one more chance to get her life together. They possessed no idea about the forged escrow account, the stolen signature, or the $120,000 sitting in a fraudulent shell company. My chest tightened, a familiar pressure pushing against my ribs. I wanted to take screenshots of the fake title commitment and broadcast them to every single person commenting on that post. I wanted to clear my name. Instead, I remembered Mr. Sterling's warning about protecting the integrity of the investigation. The situation is being handled by my attorney, Aunt Margaret. I kept my tone flat and even. I cannot discuss the details. You always were the cold one, she muttered, ending the call with a sharp click. That quiet condemnation followed me into the Ashford office on Monday morning. I had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours over the weekend, and my focus kept drifting away from the liability spreadsheets glowing on my dual monitors. My new corporate workspace smelled of fresh printer toner and stale coffee, a sterile environment that offered no comfort. I missed a crucial compliance date on a standard risk assessment file. The error was minor, but it flagged in the central system, prompting an immediate review. My new manager, a stern woman named Patricia, called me into her glass-walled office right before lunch. She placed my printed report on her desk and tapped a manicured fingernail against the highlighted date. "This is a rookie mistake, Danielle," Patricia noted, her gaze sharp and evaluating. "You were hired to catch these exact oversights." My throat felt incredibly dry. I could have offered a dozen professional excuses, but the exhaustion finally caught up with me. I am currently navigating a complex legal dispute with my family, and it is impacting my sleep schedule. I will correct the file immediately, and I promise to double-check all future submissions. Patricia did not offer me a warm smile or tell me everything would be perfectly fine. The manager simply nodded, slid a glossy brochure across the polished wood, and pointed toward the door. The pamphlet detailed the company employee assistance program, offering confidential therapy sessions. She expected me to handle my personal crisis outside of company time. I picked up the brochure, profoundly grateful for a workplace that demanded accountability instead of offering toxic sympathy. I returned to my desk and set the pamphlet down, fully intending to bury myself in the corrected spreadsheets. But my personal phone vibrated inside my purse, rattling against my keys. The caller identification displayed a Riverton area code. I stepped into a vacant conference room and answered. "You took my home, and now you are taking my career," Kelsey hissed through the receiver. The ambient noise of a busy street echoed behind her words. Victor Hale had not spent his weekend resting. The investor had packaged the fraudulent escrow file, the fake title commitment, and the closing report, sending the entire stack directly to my sister's brokerage firm. The managing broker had recognized the severe liability of employing an agent who used their professional credentials to build false trust. They had suspended her from work immediately, revoked her access to company systems, and reported the evidence to the State Real Estate Commission, which would determine whether her license should be suspended or revoked. My sister was officially locked out of her office. "I did not take anything from you," I replied, watching the Ashford traffic through the window. "Neither the apartment nor the career were mine to take. You handed them over yourself." "You set me up!" Kelsey shouted, her voice breaking. "You planned this whole thing to ruin me." I disconnected the call and blocked her number. There was no point in arguing with someone who viewed their own actions as a conspiracy committed by someone else. The full scope of her unraveling became apparent 2 days later. I drove back to Riverton on my day off to meet with Mr. Sterling and Lena, who had offered to help me organize my digital archives. Sterling sat at the head of his conference table looking grim. The attorney turned his laptop toward me, displaying a text message screenshot. "Your sister is spiraling," Sterling explained. "She sent this to the local locksmith yesterday afternoon." I leaned forward, reading the aggressive block of text. Kelsey had explicitly ordered the tradesman to contact the building manager and state that I had given prior verbal permission for the lock change. She offered to pay him double his emergency rate for the inconvenience. "She tried to bribe a witness," I said, tracing the edge of the table. "After she already knew the police and the new owner were involved. She is creating a documented trail of witness tampering," the lawyer corrected, tapping his pen against a legal pad, "which will make the civil and criminal proceedings significantly easier for Mr. Hale. But we still need to establish exactly how she obtained the raw image of your signature before we go to mediation." Lena opened my personal laptop and booted up my archived email client. We sat side by side, running keyword searches for medical bills, hospital names, and my father's old account numbers. The search took nearly an hour, yielding hundreds of painful administrative updates from the year he died. "Wait," Lena said, resting her hand on my arm. "Look at this one. From your mother." I squinted at the screen. The email was dated 8 months ago, precisely 4 weeks before Kelsey presented the fake escrow package to Victor. The subject line read, "Lost paperwork." I clicked the message. Carol had written a brief, casual request asking me to forward a high-resolution scan of the hospital payment agreement. "I lost the original copy for my tax records," my mother had typed. "Send the page with your signature at the bottom so the accountant knows it is validated." The cold reality of her betrayal settled in my stomach like a stone. My mother had not simply looked the other way while Kelsey plotted. Carol had actively gathered the ammunition. She had engineered the theft of my signature, isolating the exact document she knew would bear my name months before the trap was ever set. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, pulling my attention away from the glaring screen. "The Digital Examiner just sent over the preliminary metadata report on the fraudulent deed," the attorney announced, his voice tight with anticipation. He handed me a printed sheet of paper covered in technical routing information. The fake title commitment and the forged signature page were not created on a home computer. I looked down at the highlighted lines of code. "Your sister built the entire fraudulent escrow package on the laptop issued by her real estate brokerage," Sterling continued, "which means the firm is now directly liable, and their corporate attorneys will be tearing her life apart by Friday." The wheels of the civil justice system turned with agonizing, bureaucratic slowness. While my work in Ashford stabilized and my nights became easier to navigate, Victor Hale's legal team began the painstaking process of document discovery. After Victor filed a civil complaint against the limited liability company Kelsey had used to receive the escrow funds, his attorneys obtained targeted bank records through subpoenas and formal discovery. Those records exposed transactions my sister had assumed would remain private. My attorney sat across from me in his office 2 months later, sliding a thick summary of financial activity across the desk. The paper charted the trajectory of the $120,000 Victor had surrendered. The funds moved from the fake escrow account directly into Kelsey's corporate business bank, and from there, they dispersed like a poison into the soil of our family's life. Nearly $40,000 vanished into payments for a luxury SUV, credit card debt, and overdue utility bills. My finger stopped on a specific entry near the bottom of the page. A payment of nearly $20,000 was marked as a refund to an individual named Mrs. Alvarez. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Mr. Sterling asked. I shook my head, my eyes scanning the notes the lawyer had appended to the side of the document. The brokerage firm had discovered that Mrs. Alvarez was a former client of Kelsey's who had complained months ago when her deposit disappeared. Kelsey had desperately told the management team that she resolved the issue out of her own pocket, claiming she simply wanted to keep her clients happy. She had not used her own savings, of course. She had simply robbed Victor to pay off the woman she had already swindled. "I need to speak with her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That will not be necessary," Sterling replied, already reaching for his phone. "She is ready to testify." "Her story is chilling, Danielle. Your sister apparently broke down in her office, sobbing, begging Mrs. Alvarez not to report the missing deposit to the brokerage. Kelsey told her that if the firm found out, her family would be destroyed. I felt the weight of that lie pressing down on me. My sister had exploited my name to build a career, and then used my reputation as collateral to keep that career from imploding. I looked at the spreadsheets, seeing not just numbers, but the evidence of a woman who had spent years treating other people's lives as her personal insurance policy. I called Lena that evening, my voice heavy with doubt. I wanted to stop. Part of me, the version of me that still clung to the memory of Kelsey playing in the backyard when we were children, wanted to call Sterling and tell him to drop the investigation. It felt like I was personally dismantling the foundation of everything our parents had built. "If you stop now, who are you protecting?" Lena asked over the phone. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. I was not protecting the family I remembered. I was protecting the lies that allowed the current family to keep thriving. If I halted the discovery now, I was enabling the same cycle that had allowed Kelsey to defraud Mrs. Alvarez. The next morning, Carol sent me a photograph of my father, his smiling face captured in a frame that sat on her mantel for 20 years. Her accompanying text claimed he would be absolutely ashamed to see his daughters dragging each other through court. She was using his memory as a weapon, hoping I would prioritize the appearance of familial peace over the reality of the fraud. I sat in my apartment for a long time, staring at the screen until the light dimmed. I remembered my father's silence. I remembered how he would leave the room every single time Carol demanded money from me, how he would look at his shoes and retreat, unable to stop her but unwilling to watch me pay the price. His silence had never been a command for me to keep sacrificing myself. It was the only way he knew how to endure a lifetime of her demands. I realized then that the version of family Carol defended did not exist. I was not destroying it. It had already collapsed under the weight of her greed. The final piece of the digital puzzle arrived 3 days later. A report from a forensic examiner confirmed that the email containing the fake seller authorization had been accessed directly from Kelsey's personal smartphone. Even more damning, the digital file path revealed that the raw PDF of my signature, the one Carol had tricked me into sending for tax records, had been sent as an attachment from my mother's own private account to Kelsey's device 2 days before the fake escrow was finalized. My mother was not a bystander. She was the architect. The investigation into the brokerage's records continued to expand throughout the following month. The firm's compliance officer contacted Victor's lawyers, informing them they had officially opened a total review of every single transaction Kelsey had handled over the last 3 years. The realization that she had been juggling multiple victims hit me with the force of a physical blow. The escrow fraud was not an isolated act of desperation. It was the inevitable conclusion of a long, sustained pattern of exploitation. I had finally stopped playing the savior, and in doing so, I had forced the truth into the light where it could no longer be contained. The financial discovery phase of the civil litigation forced Carol into the light. Once Victor's attorneys uncovered the specific transfer of $38,000 from the fraudulent escrow account to my mother's personal checking, they amended the civil complaint to include her as a co-defendant. The demand for settlement landed on her doorstep like a sudden, violent storm. Carol called me twice the morning the documents arrived, but I let both calls go to voicemail. I had nothing left to say to the woman who had helped orchestrate the destruction of my reputation. When I finally walked into Mr. Sterling's office for a status update, Carol was already there, pacing the waiting room with a frantic energy that felt entirely alien to the composed woman who had once taught me how to set a dinner table. "You have to tell them it was a loan," Carol said, lunging toward me the moment I stepped through the door. "Tell them you gave me that money to help with the house. If you just sign a statement, this whole nightmare will disappear." I stepped back, keeping the width of the heavy oak desk between us. My mother looked haggard, her hair pulled into a messy knot and her hands trembling against the fabric of her coat. She genuinely believed that if I simply lied to the court, the legal machinery would stop. She could not comprehend that the evidence had already moved far beyond my ability to influence the outcome. "I cannot sign a false statement, Mom," I said, "and the court has the bank records. They know exactly where that money originated." Carol turned toward the lawyer, her expression hardening into a familiar, practiced scowl. "Can you not stop her? She is my daughter." Mr. Sterling did not even look up from his computer screen. "My client is not the one who created this situation, Mrs. Walsh. My advice to you is to retain your own counsel immediately." That afternoon, I discovered the true extent of her desperation while reviewing the disclosure files. During a session with my attorney, I found a draft affidavit tucked into the back of Kelsey's personal electronic records. It was a formal written statement where Carol planned to testify that I had verbally promised Kelsey the Lakeview apartment as compensation for her taking care of our mother in old age. I had never made such a promise, nor had I ever discussed the future of the unit with her. I looked at the home equity records that had surfaced during the discovery process. Carol had been quietly borrowing against the house for years, pulling out small sums to cover her own erratic spending and to subsidize Kelsey's failing lifestyle. I realized then that my mother had not been acting out of some maternal duty or a misguided attempt to keep us together. She had been drowning in her own financial mismanagement and viewed my apartment as the only life raft capable of keeping her afloat. She had planned to force the sale, pocket the proceeds, and use the debt to rewrite the history of our family ownership. The air in the office felt incredibly heavy. I had spent a lifetime fearing my mother's disappointment, always stepping in to patch the holes she tore in our lives. I looked at the draft affidavit again, seeing the way she had intended to use my own name to lie under oath. Carol asked to meet with me one final time, insisting we speak without lawyers present. I agreed only on the condition that we meet in Sterling's office, with his assistant acting as a witness. My mother did not start with an apology. She sat in the wooden chair looking small and brittle, and asked if she could move into my new townhouse in Ashford once she sold her own house. She told me she had nowhere else to go. She spoke as if the fraud, the forgery, and the attempt to ruin my career were just minor social inconveniences we could simply move past. You used my address, my signature, and my fear of losing you, I told her, my voice steady for the first time in years. You do not get my new address too. Carol stared at me, her eyes widening in genuine, shocked disbelief. She seemed to think I was bluffing, that if she pushed hard enough, I would eventually cave to the familiar weight of duty. She stood up, her jaw set, and delivered the final threat she had been saving for this moment. Then I will testify that you approved everything, Carol declared, her voice rising in the quiet office. I will tell the court that you were in on the entire plan from the very beginning. I did not jump. I did not cry. I simply watched as Mr. Sterling reached across the table and tapped the large digital recorder he had placed in the center of the desk. Please do, I said. Everything you just admitted to is now a matter of record. The legal storm finally broke, leaving a path of quiet destruction in its wake. Kelsey lost her real estate license after the state board finalized their review of the fraudulent escrow documents. The brokerage firm terminated her employment and forwarded the additional client complaints to the appropriate insurance carriers for further investigation. My sister went from holding the keys to the city to facing a reality where she could not even pass a basic background check for a retail position. Several months later, Kelsey stood before a judge to face the criminal charges of identity misuse, forgery, and financial fraud. Her attorneys successfully negotiated a plea agreement, likely sensing that the weight of the evidence from the project files on her office laptop to the email chains originating from Carol's own account made a trial a losing battle. She received a short period of incarceration, followed by a long term of supervised release. The court also ordered her to pay full restitution to Victor, ensuring that a portion of any future income would be garnished until the debt was satisfied. She was barred during her supervised release from working in real estate, escrow services, or any position that gave her control over client funds or property records. Carol's path to accountability followed a more conventional, exhausting route. More than a year after the fraud was discovered, the civil case moved into scheduled mediation, following months of document discovery. My mother understood that if the matter reached a public trial, the voice recordings of her conspiracy and the detailed bank statements showing the incoming funds would become part of the permanent public record. She lacked the stomach for that level of scrutiny. I watched from the sidelines as Carol signed a negotiated settlement. She agreed to repay the $38,000 she had received from the fraudulent escrow, cover a significant portion of Victor's legal fees, and place her family home on the market within 90 days. The settlement required the repayment obligation to be secured against the proceeds of the house sale, ensuring Victor would be paid when the property closed. She moved into a small, nondescript apartment in a different part of the county, leaving behind the house where I had grown up, the house where the debt had started long ago. 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, they requested one final, desperate family meeting. Kelsey was out on supervised release, and Carol claimed they needed to discuss our future. They invited me to a small cafe in a neutral town, hoping that the public setting would force me to be more compliant. I arrived 10 minutes early, sitting in a back booth with a stack of documents tucked under my arm. Kelsey looked different, her designer clothes replaced by faded, unbranded basics. Carol sat beside her, constantly wringing her hands together. They did not apologize. Instead, they launched into a rehearsed pitch about how I had always been the strong one, how I could easily afford to support them, and how I was effectively punishing them for things they claimed were just misunderstandings. So, you are really going to let us lose everything? Kelsey asked, her voice tight with the same arrogance she had worn on the day she broke into my home. You are just going to stand there and watch your own mother and sister end up with nothing? I placed 3 distinct documents on the table. The text messages about changing the locks, the voicemail where she begged me to lie about the escrow, and the bank statement showing the money Carol had accepted. For years, I stood between you and the consequences of your choices, I said, my voice steady enough to hear over the low hum of the cafe. I paid for the mistakes, I covered the debt, and I kept the secrets. And you are still punishing us? Carol hissed, her face turning a blotchy red. We are your blood. I am not punishing you, I replied, sliding the final page across the table. I am just letting you keep what you earned. I stood up, leaving them with the records of their own actions. Walking out into the cool air, I felt a strange, hollow sort of peace. My phone vibrated in my pocket, signaling an incoming call from the realtor, handling my search for a home near my new office in Ashford. The seller accepted your offer, the voice on the other end said. For the first time in my life, I was purchasing a home that no one else in my family knew how to find. I was moving toward a future that belonged entirely to me, one where no one had a spare key, and no one held a claim to the ground beneath my feet. I turned the corner, leaving the cafe and the wreckage of my old life behind, and realized I had finally learned that silence was not a form of love. 14 months after I left Riverton, I finally stepped through the doorway of my new townhouse in Ashford. The space felt modest, a quiet echo of the grand apartment I had once owned, but every square inch of this foundation belonged exclusively to me. I had purchased the property with a combination of my own savings, my salary from the regional director position, and the remaining proceeds from the legal sale of the Lakeview Towers unit. It was not a sprawling estate or a mansion, but the hardwood floors were clean, the locks were new, and no one else possessed a duplicate key. My career had continued to climb, and my professional reputation in the risk management field was now defined by my own results rather than the shadow of a family drama. I still met with a therapist through my company's employee assistance program, a practice that had helped me dismantle the reflexive guilt I carried whenever I made a decision that prioritized my own comfort. I was not perfect. I still checked the deadbolt twice before bed, and my pulse sometimes spiked when I saw an unknown number on my screen. But those were remnants of the past I was slowly learning to set aside. Kelsey was currently serving her supervised release, maintaining a quiet existence in a small studio apartment. She worked a data entry role that kept her far away from financial records or property deeds, and a portion of every paycheck was automatically deducted to satisfy the restitution order. She still sent the occasional letter to my office, pleading with me to intervene and ask Victor to reduce the debt, but I simply passed those envelopes to Mr. Sterling without breaking the seal. I had no interest in negotiating the terms of her recovery. Carol had successfully sold the family house, settling her debts, and moving into a ground-floor unit in a quiet retirement complex. She sent me a single postcard on my birthday, a plain card with the words "I miss you" scribbled in her familiar, cramped handwriting. I kept the card in my desk drawer, not because I planned to reconcile, but because I had reached a point where her attempts at manipulation no longer demanded an immediate emotional response. I could see the card, acknowledge the effort, and still choose to leave the phone unpicked. Victor had sent me a photograph of the Riverton condo a few months after the closing. Elise had taken the picture, capturing the way the hallway looked with the new, lowered light switches and the customized door handles they had installed to improve accessibility. The accompanying note was brief, stating only that the apartment had finally become a home. It was a polite, clinical update that provided a sense of closure to the transaction without requiring us to become a surrogate family. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Lena came over to help me organize the last few boxes in my basement. She glanced toward the front door, noticing the bare hook where I kept my own ring of keys. "You really do not have a spare key for anyone?" Lena asked, laughing. I turned the brass key in my fingers, watching the way it caught the light from the hallway lamp. I thought about the broken brass deadbolt Kelsey had brought to the apartment, and the locksmith who had refused to help her, and the way I had spent a lifetime holding the keys to problems that were never mine to solve. "Not yet," I said. I stepped into the hallway, locked the door, and engaged the deadbolt from the inside. The click sounded sharp and decisive in the quiet house. I was not locking the world out because I was afraid. I was locking my privacy in because I had finally earned the right to exist in a space that was entirely my own. My phone illuminated on the console table, buzzing with a notification from Carol's number. I looked at the screen, saw the familiar name, and reached out to toggle the device to silent. I did not need to decide the future of our relationship that night, or even the next month. I was done being the bridge that everyone else walked across. I turned off the light, walked into the living room, and sat in the silence of a house where the only person with a key was me. You have spent years holding the weight of problems that were never yours to solve, believing that your silence and your sacrifice were the only things keeping your family from shattering. If you have been the one constantly patching the holes left by others, you need to understand that being the responsible one does not mean you have to be the martyr. You were taught that boundaries are an act of betrayal and that keeping the peace is your primary responsibility, but that peace was built on your own exhaustion. Realizing that you are being exploited is not a failure of your character. It is the first step toward reclaiming your own life. You have the right to stop funding, fixing, and apologizing for the behavior of people who refuse to change, regardless of the blood they share with you. Setting a hard limit, whether it involves your finances, your property, or your emotional availability, is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of survival. When you finally stop standing between the people you love and the natural consequences of their actions, you might feel an immense surge of guilt, or perhaps you will be met with accusations of being cold or selfish. Let them say it. Those labels are usually the last defense used by those who have lost their leverage over you. You are not responsible for managing the lives of adults who prioritize their own ease over your security and your mental health. True family dynamics do not require one person to be the permanent safety net for the others. If you are currently in a situation where your kindness is being treated as a weakness and your assets are being viewed as communal property, you must start building your own exit plan today. Start by securing your financial and legal independence. Move your documents to a safe location, update your passwords, and ensure that no one else has access to the accounts or the keys that dictate your freedom. You do not have to announce these changes to the world, you simply have to make them. If you are waiting for a moment where your family will suddenly understand the extent of what you have been doing for them, you may be waiting for a long time. You have to be the one to change the dynamic, because those benefiting from your silence have no incentive to do so. Has there been a time in your life when you felt forced to sacrifice your own needs to maintain a facade of family harmony, and what was the turning point that finally made you decide to put your own life first?